Hi, I'm Bill Robertson, and I'm a local historian and also a French and Indian War reenactor. And today I'd like to talk about how the French and Indian War began right in our own backyard here in western Pennsylvania. And back in the mid-1700s, Pennsylvania at that point was a huge wilderness. It was kind of a scary place. There were great big mountain lions that were ready to jump on anybody that came near them and devour them, of course. Also, there were hills full of rattlesnakes where you couldn't even go. And really the only possible way to get through this region was by taking a canoe down the Allegheny River. And the Allegheny River was really the only major highway through western Pennsylvania in the 1750s. And as a result, control of that river was the reason that the French and Indian War began, because there were three different groups who wanted control of the Allegheny. First of all, there were the Indians who lived here, of course, especially the Iroquois, and more specific, the Seneca branch of the Iroquois. Also, there were the French and the English. The Iroquois called the Allegheny River the O-He-O. And if you go over by Salamanca and enter the Indian reservation, you'll see a sign for the O-E-O right along the road. The French, on the other hand, called the Allegheny La Belle Rivière, meaning the beautiful river. And it was beautiful to the French because they loved to come down in here and they liked to actually live with the Indians and become assimilated with the Indians. And they had no intention of trying to build settlements here. They just wanted to trap, they wanted to hunt down here, and they wanted to be friends with the Indians. Also, they gave the Indians a lot of gifts, like gunpowder and things that they needed. So the Indians and the French, for most part, were really friendly. The only tribe that didn't like the French were the Iroquois, because on one of the first expeditions from Canada that the French took, they shot at a bunch of the Iroquois and killed a whole war party and turned the tribe against them. So the Iroquois would then side with the English. The Iroquois and the other, the Senecas, obviously needed the Allegheny River because they needed to travel, and also as a prime beaver trapping area. And the Iroquois would trap the beaver and then would trade the beaver hides for the necessities of life with the Europeans. And some of the necessities they needed obviously were muskets, gunpowder, cloth, blankets, iron pots, steel knives, things of that nature that they needed, to carry on their everyday life. The French, on the other hand, also needed the Allegheny River for trapping and to connect themselves with their southern territories down in Louisiana. So they too were really interested in having the Allegheny River under their control. The English, on the other hand, wanted to settle up here. They wanted to chase the Indians out. They wanted to build farms. And as a result, most of the Indian tribes then were against them, obviously, because they didn't want to get kicked out of their own hunting grounds and be basically chased further west. The French began trying to get control of the Allegheny in 1749 when they sent Captain Pierre Celeron on an expedition from Lake Erie down Chautauqua Lake over to the Conowongo Creek, which they went down in canoes. And when they arrived at present-day Warren, which was nothing, there was nothing there at that point, then they were at the Allegheny River. And all along his route, Celeron buried all these lead plates claiming the Allegheny region for the King of France. In 1753, the French became even more aggressive when they started building a string of forts from Lake Erie down part of the Allegheny River. And this caused a lot of problems. First of all, it broke the treaty with the Iroquois that they had signed in 1710 in Montreal, saying that they would not infringe on the Iroquois territory. So the Iroquois were all up in arms about that. It also ruffled the English feathers because they considered the Allegheny River Valley as part of their territory. And so in the fall of 1753, October to be exact, Governor Dinwiddie of Virginia sent young George Washington on a spy mission up into this area to check on the situation. And in October, it was pretty late in the season, and it was really cold at that point, and Washington barely made it up to Fort LeBoeuf in present-day Waterford, Pennsylvania. And when he got there, he demanded that the French leave. And again, he gave him a message from Dinwiddie that, again, said that we want you to leave this area. And obviously, he got laughed out of the fort. And on his way back to Virginia, he had two really very close calls. First of all, the Indian guide that was leading him south was actually intent on murdering him. And he spun around on the trail and shot 15 paces away at Washington and somehow missed him. And so they tackled the Indian and bound his hands and sent him on his way. And then they knew that they had to take to the river and get away from there as fast as they could. And so they built this little raft and started down the Allegheny. And when they did, these chunks of ice broke apart their raft, and Washington almost drowned. But luckily, his guide, Christopher Gist, dragged him onto an island and basically, built a little fire there and gave Washington all his clothes to cover up with, and Washington survived that too. It was almost like God was protecting Washington. You're going to see another situation of that later on, so that he could be, the first president of our great nation. In 1754, the spring of, the French, instead of leaving for Canada, went further south on the Allegheny River and built Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio, which is where present-day Pittsburgh is today. And this, again, accelerated the situation even more. As soon as Governor Dinwiddie heard of that, he organized an army again under Washington and sent them into Pennsylvania to attack Fort Duquesne. The first conflict that actually occurred was before they reached the fort at a place called Jumonville Glen. At that point, Washington and his Iroquois allies surrounded a scouting party of French, killed and scalped a lot of them, and took the rest of them prisoner. And that was the first shots fired in the French and Indian War. And by the way, the French and Indian War was the First World War, because after it happened or started here in Pennsylvania, it spread all over Europe too. So if anyone asks you, what was the First World War? You'd say the French and Indian War, which you'd be absolutely right. All right, after Washington was successful in that first attack, he retreated back to Fort Necessity, which was just a wee little tiny fort that he had built out of necessity. And he had just gotten back there, and a large force of French and Indians attacked him, and he was not able to withstand the attack, and so he had to surrender. And he and his men were forced to return to Virginia with their tails between their legs. The following spring, 1755, a large British force was sent from England and gathered down at Fort Cumberland in Maryland. And Edward Braddock was the leader of this group. And he was a real arrogant SOB, to say the least. I don't know if I can say SOB on the camera, but I guess I can. But anyway, he was so arrogant, he thought that, you know, he would just go up there and wipe out the French and Indians without even firing a musket. I mean, that's how arrogant he was. And so he proceeded along the Monongahela River. And the problem was he had to actually build his own road by cutting down a bunch of trees to get all of his baggage through that area. And he got within a few miles of Fort Duquesne, and he encountered a small force of French Marines and Indians. And his advance guard fired on the French and Indians, and they scattered into the bushes, totally surrounded the redcoats, and started shooting from cover. And Edward Braddock was so arrogant, he made his men stand right out in the open in their bright red coats and fire volleys at the Indians they couldn't even see. And so naturally the redcoats got slaughtered bad during that engagement. And he lost basically his whole army. And there were two consequences of that. Well, first of all, I should return to Washington. During that conflict, or during that battle, every British officer was either wounded or killed, including Braddock himself. The only officer who escaped unscathed was Washington. And the Indians tried shooting at him like 40 times, and he had all these bullet holes through his uniform, but not one bullet hole in his body. And finally the chief said, "Don't shoot at him anymore, because he's protected by the Great Spirit." That's really, I always like that story. I think it's really cool, because it's sort of like he was destined again to become President of the United States. Another real bad consequence of Braddock's defeat was that the Delaware Indians went on the warpath. And the Delawares were living on the Allegheny, and their base of operations was Kittanning, which is present-day Kittanning, Pennsylvania. And they gathered forces there, and they went all through Pennsylvania, all through western Pennsylvania, and burned everything they encountered, including some of the forts. They raised total havoc because, again, they were emboldened because Braddock's whole force got wiped out, and it showed how weak the English actually were. And the Delawares were really chomping at the bit, trying to get revenge on the English who had cheated them in the walking purchase. And this happened in 1737, when Pennsylvania made a treaty with the Delawares and said that they would buy all the land from the Delawares that they could get by walking for a day and a half. But the Delawares got cheated because the colonials used athletes, were fast walkers, and so they got like twice as much land as they should have, and they gave, you know, the Delawares just a little bit of money for all that land. And then the Delawares couldn't live there anymore because they didn't have any hunting grounds left, and so they had to move to western Pennsylvania. And that was the reason they were so eager to get revenge on the Pennsylvanians who had cheated them in that manner. Okay, next I'd like to do a short PowerPoint presentation giving you some information about the armies that fought in the French and Indian War. If you'd like to learn a lot about the history of the French and Indian War, a very close site to Bradford is up at Old Fort Niagara on Lake Ontario. And they have the fort as it looked back in the French and Indian War, along with the cool old castle that's up there. And the castle also was haunted. There was an officer named Henri Leclerc who took an Indian maid to a party, and one of his officer friends started putting the moves on the maid. So naturally, Henri Leclerc wasn't going to put up with that, and he got into a fight with the guy, and in the process lost his head literally when the guy killed him and cut off his head and threw it in Lake Ontario. And so now, if you go up to the castle, you'll see the ghost of Henri Leclerc wandering around looking everywhere for his head. Old Fort Niagara is also the site of a really cool battle reenactment that takes place over the 4th of July weekend every year. And they have like 2,000 reenactors show up for this, and the French defend the fort, and the English and their Indian allies try to attack the fort. And it goes on for like an hour. It's really cool. I was up there and took a whole bunch of pictures of the whole thing, and was able to get some really cool shots of all the reenactors and all the various battle scenes. And it's just a really neat way to take a close and personal look at history. Another really neat place that's close to us that you can also learn a lot about the French Indian War is down at Cook Forest. During the weekend before Father's Day every year, they have a forest battle reenactment, and it's Saturday and Sunday both. And during that reenactment, some of the French will guard this little fort that they make out in the woods, and then the English attack it. And again, it's just cool because you get to see all the uniforms of the men, you get to see, what an actual skirmish was like during that time. And most of the battles that took place in the woods was just guys hiding behind trees shooting at the Indians and vice versa. There weren't really a lot of strategy involved. The men didn't line up in lines or anything. It was just basically from tree to tree, as they say, as the men shoot at each other and try to gain an advantage. Also, I should probably mention how the women dressed in the French and Indian War before I get into the soldiers themselves. And here's a picture of a friend of mine who is dressed up in a very colorful dress, and they always had the sunbonnet, and they had really beautiful garb that they would wear, especially the ladies would wear day to day. The girls, however, and the women who lived on the frontier would be made up more like this. And notice one of the prominent parts of her gear is the apron that covers the whole front of her dress, because a lot of these poor women work from sun up to sundown. They're up from daylight to dark, doing all the chores on the farm. And also notice that she's barefooted because there wasn't roads or anything in those days. You were walking on the grass, and it was more comfortable just to go out in your bare feet. Now I'd like to talk about the French and how they were prepared for war. And this is a picture of a French Marine officer, and you notice that this particular gentleman had a white coat, also trimmed in a light blue color. And these were the men who actually served on the Allegheny, the Marines de Contrecoeur. And they were good at paddling these long boats up and down the river. They were called bateaux. They were flat-bottom boats. And the guys were really adept at doing that, and also guarding the forts and outposts all along the Allegheny River. And notice they have powder blue uniforms with a tri-corner hat. And this is a picture of the French Marines in action. And what they would do is they would line up in a row and fire volleys at the enemy. A lot of the French militia down here, the French forces, were miliciens or militia. And these were just guys who would come down in the summer and spend the whole summer down here fighting the battles, and then as soon as it got to be fall, they would go back to Canada, harvest their crops, and spend the whole winter with their families. And these guys were just, like basically farmers, woodsmen who came down here to help the regular troops and the Indians. And probably the most distinctive feature of their uniform was this red hat. Other than that, they just wore their work clothes. And now we're talking about the Indians who aligned themselves with the French. And those included the Ottawas, the Delawares, and the Shawnees. And these were, again, eastern woodland Indians who loved battle. That was how they proved their bravery, is by going into battle. And one of the main objectives of the Indians joining in the French and Indian War is to take captives. They would take the captives back to their villages, adopt them into their tribes, and build up the number of people that they had in their tribe. And usually they would just take girls, young boys. If the women protested too much that they took captive, they would just put a hatchet in their head and kill them right there. Same with babies. They didn't want to take babies with them because that would be too much problem. So the Indian warfare was adopted also by the Virginia militia, and also adopted by the French Militian and actually the French army. And it involved one soldier, one tree, like I said before. You scattered for cover as soon as you saw the enemy and shot shot an ambush or shot from behind trees or shot from behind rocks, anything you could to protect yourself. And that was where the British ran into problems, because they would again line up, stand right out in the open in their bright red coats, let the Indians pick them off one by one. And one Indian chief bragged that he was going to pick off all the English like one pigeon. And this is a photo of what a Delaware warrior might have looked like, the ones that burned all of western Pennsylvania after Braddock was defeated. And he's a good friend of mine. And here's another warrior. This is big Tom Hinkleman. He's a scary dude. He's about 6'8", and he works in the construction field, and he's all muscle. And he has all that scary mask on his face, and man, when you see him coming in the woods, you want to run the other way. Okay, and the Indians would paint their faces because it intimidated the enemy. It made them look like screaming demons coming up out of the woods. And also, too, the Indians would rather, to prove their manhood, attack you in close quarters and club you over the head with one of these war clubs, or stab you with a knife, or use their hatchet on you, rather than shoot from behind a tree, because that proved how much of a man they were, how great a warrior they were. And so that was another part of the Indian warfares. After they shot at you for a while and got you pretty scared, then they would close in on you, rush you, and then attack you and fight you hand to hand with either a club like this, and I can't imagine getting bonked on the head with that, or hatchet you. That was another one of their favorite weapons. And here's another scary looking guy. Look at his mask that he painted on his face with war paint. And again, fear and intimidation was the reason that they would paint themselves like that. Put a Halloween mask on, basically, to try to scare the devil out of the enemy. Now the colonial soldiers. The colonial soldiers were basically just farmers who came in out of the field, much like the Minutemen in the Revolutionary War. They would be called into service to protect their homes. They didn't have any formal military training. And again, they would use Indian warfare because it would be smarter to hide behind trees and rocks and fight back that way than to stand out in the open. And usually these guys were good hunters too, and good shots, because the muskets they used, you only fired one shot, and if you didn't kill what you were aiming at, it would take a long time to reload the gun, and they might starve for that week if they didn't shoot the deer they were shooting at one shot. Okay, I portray an English Ranger. There are a couple of my buddies, Larry Fox and Clarence Walker, and we're down at Cook Forest at that battle reenactment there. And again, our purpose as English Rangers would be to go out and look for the enemy. You know, we would go out and see if there are any war parties coming, and if we found Indians that were coming towards a village, we'd run back and warn the inhabitants so that they could either evacuate or get ready to fight. War party was too great, obviously they would just flee, but sometimes, you know, they would even have a blockhouse in their village, and then the men and the women and children could hide in the blockhouse if they were warned in time. I like being an English Ranger because all they do is hide behind trees and shoot at the Indians. I don't have to march in formation or any of that stuff. I don't have a bright red coat on to make me a better target either. And as I mentioned before, the Rangers fight like Indians. Again, they would scatter into the brush and use cover to their advantage. Okay, one formal group of Rangers that fought in the French and Indian War were Rogers Rangers. And they were formed by Robert Rogers, and they actually worked as an arm of the British Army. And they even had uniforms, these green uniforms, that would, again, hide them in the brush a lot better. And if you want to learn a lot about them, there's a really neat book. It's called Robert Rogers, Rangers, and the French and Indian War. It describes all the equipment that they had, the guns they used, the tactics they used. As a matter of fact, Rogers Rangers created a set of tactics that are still used today by U.S. Rangers. So he was way ahead of his time. And there's a list of those tactics listed in the back of the book. One of them said that if you're walking in single file, make sure there's enough room between you and a guy in front of you, so that if someone shoots at you, they can't kill 2 men with 1 shot. He had a lot of really cool, common sense things that the Rangers would use to protect themselves while on a campaign. Okay, the Pennsylvania Militia also dressed in green coats. And the Pennsylvania Militia played a very important role in the French and Indian War, in that they attacked the town of Kittanning that the Delawares are using as a terrorist base, basically, and burned the place to the ground and chased all the Indians further west, and actually put an end to the Delaware threat. This took place long after the Delawares had already burned everything they could lay their hands on, including the forts right around our area. So it was really interesting that the Pennsylvania Militia, again, would use the same tactics as the Indians and use fire against fire. Okay, the British regulars, as I mentioned before, were very colorful. They wear their bright red uniforms, usually trimmed in blue or whatever color their particular regiment would designate. Someone would be trimmed in white, some would be trimmed in more red, and again, it depended upon which regiment you belonged to. And these guys, again, fought in the European style. They would march in formation, they would wheel, they would line up in 2 lines, they would face the enemy, and they would fire their guns in volleys. And after the first unit that was on their knees would shoot, then the second group would shoot over their shoulders while the first group would reload their guns. And then they would keep up continuous fire for a long period of time. And they used the Brown Bess musket, which was a 75 caliber gun, a smoothbore. And the smoothbores only were accurate up to 80 yards. And so they had to fire in volleys because they figured if they got enough lead in the air, they've got to hit somebody. And they just weren't adapted, though, to American warfare. They just, they stuck out like a sore thumb in the middle of a clearing, and the Indians really had an easy time with them. Another funny thing is that instead of sneaking up on the enemy, they would have the drummers and bagpipers out front announcing their presence in the woods. So the Indians would have plenty of notice that they were coming and could prepare to slaughter them. I mean, how dumb is that? But again, that was the European tactics, which did not work in America. As I mentioned earlier, the men would form up and fire volleys, meaning all of them would shoot at the same time to get a lot of lead in the air. The Scottish troops, on the other hand, were a little bit better, and the Indians feared them because they were such fierce fighters. The Indians called the Scottish troops the men without pants because they wore kilts into the field. And they would use their claymores, and they would get right in there and fight the Indians hand to hand and best the Indians at their own tactic. And they did a lot of really good, especially in the close combat fighting. And finally, we have the Iroquois who sided with the English. As I mentioned before, the reason they did that is because of a long-standing feud with the French. And this is a good picture of how the Indians would dress, the Iroquois would dress as they went into combat. Okay, next I'd like to show you some of the gear I've collected in my years of reenacting. And I'll start with the military weapons. This first gun I'd like to show you is a pre-Charleville French musket. The Charleville was a 69 caliber smoothbore musket that the French used normally, but this one predates that. And this also is a 69 caliber, and being that it's a smoothbore, again it shoots a round ball, and also it's only accurate basically up to 80 yards. And you're lucky if you hit anything more than 50 yards away with this thing. And the way that they loaded these guns was the French would have what they called a belly box. And this they would wear right around their belly. And inside the belly box would be a paper cartridge. And the paper cartridge would have the amount of powder that they would need to shoot the gun, along with the round ball, the 69 caliber ball that they would need in the gun too. So basically what they would do is they would bite off the end of the paper cartridge with their teeth, pour the powder down the barrel, then they would take the ball, that 69 caliber ball, drop it down the barrel, then take out the ramrod and ram the whole thing down. Oops, I lost my ramrod. Then they would make sure to replace the ramrod so they'd have it for the next time. Then they would pick up their gun, they would cock their hammer to half cock, then they would pull back their frizzen, pour in some powder, priming powder, then they would drop their frizzen back over the priming powder, they would cock their gun to full cock, raise their rifle, and fire. And as you can see, when the flint in the hammer would hit the frizzen, it would make a spark. And the spark would go down, ignite the powder in the pan, which would then shoot the gun. And these guys really had it pretty easy because all their ammunition was pre-made for them. They'd have it in the belly box that they wore around their stomach, and it'd be right-handed, so that they could, load and refire pretty fast, load and fire pretty fast. Also, they were armed with a bayonet that they would attach to the end of their rifle, which they could use, again, especially if they were in close combat with other troops. I don't think I'd want to be hit with this because it has a blood groove in the middle to make sure you can pull it out a little bit easier. See the blood groove there where the blood would drip out. Not a very nice thing to be stabbed with, to say the least. I, on the other hand, am an English Ranger, and I'd like to next talk about what I would be armed with. First of all, I would be armed with one of these, actually a rifled musket, meaning there was rifling in the barrel, which made it a lot more accurate. This gun was accurate up to 300 yards. As a matter of fact, some of the hunters would use these guns to bark squirrels off a tree. They didn't want to hit the squirrel because they'd blow it all to pieces, so they shoot next to the squirrel, blow bark against the squirrel, and kill it that way. So these are very accurate guns for the time. Okay, unfortunately, as an English Ranger, you didn't have your ammunition made up for you. Instead, you had to load your gun from a powder horn. You had to load these 50 caliber rifled muskets. First of all, you had to start by loading them down the muzzle of the gun. And that's why they call them muzzle loaders, because that's how you loaded them. And you would first of all have to put powder down the barrel. You'd have to uncork your powder horn. You notice as a civilian, I didn't have pre-made ammunition for myself. Instead, I had to do it by hand. And then you couldn't just take the powder horn and start dumping powder down the barrel, or you'd blow up your gun if you got too much down there. So instead, you had to have a powder horn, a lot of times made out of a deer antler, which would have just the amount of powder you would need, the number of grains that were necessary. And so you would dump your powder horn, dump the powder into your powder measure, then you would dump that down the barrel. Once that was done, you'd dig a round ball out of your pouch, cover it with a piece of cloth. This was called a patched ball. And then you would take and fit that over your barrel. Then you had to get rid of the excess cloth by taking your knife, your patch knife, out of your neck holster here, or neck sheath, cut off the excess cloth, and then you would take and ram the ball down the barrel with your ramrod. By the way, Indians would not only sometimes carry a patch knife around their neck, they'd have their scalping knife there too, because they like nothing better than to knock someone down and cut the top of their head right off, or cut their scalp off with their scalping knife. Okay, then you would ram home the ball in the cloth, like so. Again, replace your ramrod so you had it for the next time. Then you would cock your gun to half cock. Again, this thing, the frizzen, which makes the spark, you push it up, fill this area here with your powder, little priming powder in a priming pan. Then you would flip your frizzen down, cock it to full cock, line up your sights and fire. And again, notice the sparks that fly out, and the sparks go down into the pan, set that powder on fire, which then shoots your gun. So again, it's basically the same thing as the other gun, except this one, again, is more accurate, up to 300 yards, and it's just a better weapon all the way around. Some of the other stuff that the English Rangers would carry into battle with them would naturally be a hatchet, because if they were in close combat with the Indians, they have to defend themselves. And these guys were woodsmen, and they were just as good at the hatchet as the Indians were. Also, too, another thing that you had to have to defend yourself was a good knife. And this knife is actually patterned after one that they would use during that time period, and this one's double-bladed. So not only could you use it to defend yourself in a battle, you also could use it like to cut firewood or to, do other things around the campsite with. So a good knife, a hatchet, and a gun were essential to the English Rangers. Also, too, they would have with them what they called their possibles bag. And they called it that because anything possible would fit in it. For example, you would have in there your little poke that would contain all of your bullets that you would need, your round balls. You might have a pack of cards in case you're bored along the trail and you sat down with your buddies. You might have some playing cards from that era. You might have a little flask with a little rum in it. And this, sometimes they carried an extra little powder horn that have their priming powder in, which would be a little bit finer that they would use in the barrel. Also, you might have a wooden comb, because they didn't bathe that often, so you might have to, again, brush the lice out of your hair. You might have a wooden spoon in case you made a little stew along the trail. And this is actually the stopper for your liquor container. And also you might have a turkey call, a homemade turkey call out of a couple chicken bones. They could call in a turkey for dinner. So again, they call it the possibles bag because anything possible would fit in. Okay, also I wanted to talk a little bit about the clothing that was worn by the Rangers. And if you notice, they have on this long smock, which was essential to keep the rain and stuff off you. Also, I would wear one of these hats like this, because this hat would protect you from the weather better than the tri-corner hat, which was fashionable among military circles, and also mostly the civilians would wear these tri-corner hats. This hat, again, protected you a little more because of the wide brim. You wouldn't have to worry about the water running down your neck while you're out there in the woods trying to find your way from one place to the other. Also, a lot of times, the Rangers, instead of wearing these long leather pants made out of deerskin or some other leather, they would instead wear these knee breeches. And the knee breeches were quite popular with the Rangers as well. They were made at home by their wives, no doubt. Also, with the knee breeches, you would have a pair of long stockings. And over the stockings, to protect yourself from the real thick brush, you would put a pair of leggings. And these leggings would fit over the stockings and would keep you from getting all scratched up by brambles and briars and things. And some of them were made out of wool like these are, and some of them were made out of leather. And again, all this stuff is very functional because you want to protect yourself when you're out in the woods going from place to place. And a lot of the English Rangers were trappers and hunters before they joined the Army. And they would go out looking for wolves, you know, that they would kill and skin and use the skins to trade for the things they needed. There were also the muskrats, again, that they would trap for. But primarily it was beaver pelts that they, you know, that was the most popular and most in demand, because over in Europe, the beaver hats were all in style. And also there were other beaver clothing that was being made over in Europe. And one other thing that I should show you before I talk a little bit about the books I used to write my own books is this gorget. And this the officers would wear around their neck to show their rank. Instead of having epaulets on their shoulders, they would have one of these gorgets instead. And I got in big trouble at one of the reenactments because I wore one of these, and I had a couple of reenactors come up and say, "What do you got that on for? You're not an officer." So they made me actually take it off because this was something that showed your rank, and I wasn't of that rank and didn't deserve to have it on. Okay, next I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the books I used to write some of the books I wrote. And I've written a 3-novel series about the French and Indian War. And the first book is called Ambush in the Alleghenies. And this actually tells the story of 4 mountain men guys who are out here in the wilderness of Pennsylvania minding their own business. And they keep getting captured by the Indians. And the one gentleman has to run the gauntlet, which was 2 lines of Indians that would line up armed with weapons, and you have to run between them, and they would be whacking at you, trying to knock you down. If they knocked you down, then they would jump on you and they would kill you. But his name was Leighton Jack Hawkins, and he was real fast, and so he was able to outrun the Indians. And then another one of my main characters is Bear Bite Bob Winslow, and he's an old coot, a real old guy that had been in the wilderness forever, and he got his name because he got really badly mauled by a bear and he lived through it. So that was how he got his handle, as they say. Also, there was another kid that was named Will Big Cat Cutler. And he was able to get his name because he fought this giant mountain lion that tried to kill the horses he was supposed to be watching. And he killed the mountain lion instead. And so all these mountain men characters I have in my book all have colorful names that, you know, tell a little bit about the personality of the character. Also, you learn a lot about George Washington in this particular book. You're introduced to Washington when he was just a 21-year-old major, was 6 feet 3 tall, with red hair. You know, you think of Washington from the picture in the old schools where he has white hair. Well, in those days, as a young man, he had bright red hair. And also you learn why the men respected him and, you know, how good of a commander he really was. And also you learn a lot about some of the skills that the mountain men had to use to survive out here in the wilderness of Pennsylvania. And you learn too about the Indians and some of their ceremonies, like the ceremony they used to adopt a white man into their tribe, the marriage ceremony that they have, which includes the bride and groom wearing rabbit skin clothes, because, you know, rabbits are very fertile and they wanted kids in those days, lots of kids. So that was part of their ceremony, supposedly to make sure that a lot of children were born to the couple. And also, there's a lot of good history in this book. You learn about Braddock's defeat, you learn about the Battle of Fort Necessity, you learn about George Washington's spy mission up to Fort LeBoeuf. So all the history's there along with a good adventure story. The second book that I wrote is called Attack in the Alleghenies. And this one deals with what happened in Pennsylvania after Braddock was wiped out and the Delawares went on the warpath. And you follow the Delawares from Kittanning into Pennsylvania and watch them burn down forts, slaughter people, and eventually get chased out of Kittanning themselves when the Pennsylvania Militia under Colonel Armstrong comes and burns their village in turn. Finally, I've written Annihilated in the Alleghenies. And this book deals with all the campaigns down around Fort Fort Ligonier. And this tells how the French are eventually expelled from Pennsylvania. And I can't forget to say, too, that my writing partner, David Reimer, helped me with ambushing the Alleghenies and attacking the Alleghenies. And he also, is a really good historian, and he did a lot to help me out when I was writing those two books. Some of the different resource materials I use in my own writing, believe it or not, started with Ben Bowie and his Mountain Men comic book that I got back when I was just a little boy back in the 1950s. If I was good for the barber, my dad would always take me across the street to Paul's Pharmacy and would buy me a comic book. And I invariably would buy these Ben Bowie and his Mountain Men books, which talked about these mountain men, eastern mountain men that lived around here and all the struggles they had during the French and Indian War period. So I guess the seed for writing these books, my own books, was set way back in the 1950s when I was like 9 years old. These books are really cool because they also have in them a lot of the slang language used by the mountain men. Like instead of saying wow, the mountain men would say wah. Instead of saying shoot, shoot, they would say burn powder. When they were trying to encourage their friends to watch out for themselves, they would say watch your top knot, because the top knot's the part of your hair that the Indian would take off if they scalped you. So a lot of cool language I took from these comic books too, because they're really well done. They may be comic books, but there's a lot of research that went into them. Another book that was very, very important in my writing of Ambush in the Alleghenies was called Young George Washington Frontier Spy. And this was written by Betty M. Richmond, who lives over in Meadville. And she has in here George Washington's diary that he kept during a spy mission, and also has really good maps and talks all about, everything that actually happened to him when he went to Fort LeBoeuf and on his way home. So I'm really indebted to Betty M. Richmond for writing this book. Another book, too, that's really quite helpful is The Indian Wars of Pennsylvania by C. Hale Sipe. And this book has every battle that ever took place in Pennsylvania with the Indians. And they give detailed accounts, which is quite helpful, because when I write a book, I want to make sure that the history is correct, that I describe the battle correctly, and there's not any mistakes there, because anybody who knows this stuff would pick you apart if you start making mistakes in the history. So this was, again, very helpful. Another book, too, that I love from my youth is Indian Wars and Warriors East. And I begged my mom and dad to buy me this for Christmas one year. After I'd read all those Ben Bowie Mountain Men comic books, I wanted more information. I got real hungry to learn more and more about the Indians of the eastern woods. So I got this book for Christmas one year after I begged and pleaded for about 4 months. Finally, my parents broke down and bought it for me. Also, I want to say that I'm not done reenacting yet either, and I'm looking forward to next summer when this virus stuff is over and I can go back and actually participate in some of these reenactments. I'm looking forward especially to going to Crook Forest. And I invite you to come down. It's the weekend before Father's Day in June every year. It's at the Crook Forest State Park, and there's a ton of reenactors come. We have a great time reenacting 2 forest battles each day, the Saturday and the Sunday. And if you want a real taste of what the French and Indian War was all about, I welcome you to come down. Thank you very much.